Hello everyone and welcome back. It's been a while, but we are finally back with the Jagdpanther. Today we are all about painting with acrylics. Let's get started. First, the model needs to be disassembled into smaller sub-assemblies to make painting easier. Then the primer can be applied. For my armored vehicles, I prefer to use the black primer from Vallejo's Mecha Primer range. I thin the primer with a few drops of flow improver to achieve a smoother application and paint flow. The primer adheres so well that I have never had to wash my models with soapy water beforehand, and the paint still adheres perfectly. Once all the parts are primed, I let them dry for at least 24 hours. I want to leave some parts of my Jagdpanther in its original red factory primer. Mainly the lower hull and the rear of the wheels. I'm using RAL 8012 Red Brown for this. The shade that closely matches historical references for red oxide primer. In the final stages of war, Germany lacked the time and resources to paint all their tank parts dark yellow. Therefore, less visible and less important areas were left in their original factory color. Then we apply the base color for the camouflage. As with almost all German vehicles from the middle to late half of the war, we use dark yellow. AK's third generation acrylic paints offer 3 premixed versions for this. One of them is called Initial and is the yellowest and most saturated one. This version is probably the most commonly used and is also the one I'm using here. Another variant is the 1944 version, which is significantly darker. I tried it on my Hetzer. In my opinion, it looks a bit unusual, but compared to historical photos, the shade is also accurate. Finally, there's Dark Yellow 3, a very light and less saturated color intended for vehicles from the late stages of the war and for what-if scenarios. I really like using this shade for highlights. I always thin my paints with the brand's recommended thinner. For the camouflage pattern, I will be going with the classic 3-tone color scheme. I will try once again to spray the camouflage pattern freehand. Apparently, acrylic paints aren't as suitable for this as lacquer-based paints, but I will give it a shot anyway. To get a relatively sharp edge, it's important to thin the paint more and spray with less pressure. I used about 1 bar here. I'm starting with the red-brown. The pattern I chose has fewer but larger spots. This makes spraying a bit easier for me, as I have more leeway for mistakes. Since the paint is more diluted, it naturally has less coverage. Therefore, it's necessary to work in many layers. The distance between the model and the airbrush is crucial for the result. The closer the distance, the denser the paint spray and the thinner the lines can be. However, if you're too close and the paint is too runny, the air pressure can cause the paint to run unintentionally. Therefore, it's always a good idea to test everything beforehand. One advantage over masking is that it is significantly easier to apply camouflage to uneven surfaces or over edges. And this is what the brown spots look like. Next come the green ones. The procedure here is the same as with the brown. However, different shades of color spray differently, and you may need to adjust the air pressure or dilution. In some places, I still need masking tape. I want to paint the gun mantlet entirely green. I also want to add a kind of wave pattern to the gun barrel. Since I need straight edges for this, I have to quickly cut some masking tape to size and apply it. I will also paint some of the road wheels green or brown respectively. And this is what our camouflage scheme looks like now. It looks pretty good, but the colors are a bit too intense and dark for my taste. Therefore, I will lighten everything up a bit. For this, I will use slightly lighter shades of the corresponding base colors. I then spray this onto the previously painted areas in an irregular pattern. For this, I need to thin the paints even more because I don't want to completely cover the previous color. However, the AK 3rd Gen acrylic paints seem to have reached their limit in terms of thinning. No matter what air pressure I tried, they couldn't be applied properly when thinned that much. Therefore, I tried the new Atom colors from Ammo by Mick. These are also acrylic paints, but they promise to behave like lacquer-based paints. And I must say, they spray very well, even with a high dilution. That's exactly what I needed here, as I didn't want to work with actual lacquer-based paints. I'm now applying these light colors all over the vehicle, making the horizontal areas lighter than the rest. By applying the colors unevenly, I'm also achieving the first of many weathering effects, which will make the vehicle look more used. The colors appear faded, as if the tank has been in use for months. I think I will try painting my next German tank entirely in Atom colors, as I'm really interested in what possibilities these new colors offer. The Jagdpanther comes with additional anti-aircraft armor. I'm not sure if these were field modifications or actual factory installed parts. I'll treat them as scratch build modifications and prime them in a rust color. That will add a bit more variation. In the past, I often painted the rubber rings of the road wheels a very dark, almost black grey. But a lighter grey, like this one, is more realistic. The road wheels have a small lip, which makes it very easy to paint only the outermost edge. However, the connected road wheels were a bit more awkward to paint, as they are somewhat unwieldy. The middle wheels have a protruding edge that would be worn down by the tracks, revealing the bare metal. Here I'm also testing a new product for myself, the acrylic markers from AK Interactive. Since I only need to paint the protruding ring, these markers are perfect for that. The opacity is also very good, as I can achieve full coverage in most areas with just one coat of paint. The inside of the hatches was later painted by the crew in the same color as the exterior. Since the paint was less frequently exposed to the sun here, it hasn't faded as much. I'm using Vallejo's dark yellow for this, as it is a more intense yellow. Next up is chipping. As always, I will be doing a two-stage chipping process. I will start with a lighter Dunkelgelb as a base color. I dip a small piece of sponge into my paint and load most of it onto a kitchen towel. Then I dab the sponge over the edges of my tank. This leaves many small irregular spots, which represent small scratches and chips in the camouflage. Alternatively, I could of course paint them individually with a fine brush. While this would give me significantly more control, it would probably take 10 times as long. And since this is only the first of two steps, I'm choosing the faster method. The more paint the sponge contains, the larger the speckles will be. Since each piece of sponge leaves a different pattern, it's a good idea to change or rotate the sponge occasionally, otherwise the pattern might repeat itself. If I wanted to go into even more detail, I would have to paint light brown and light green chips on the brown and green areas respectively. But that would be significantly more work. At this scale, it's therefore sufficient to paint the chips yellow as a first step. This simulates chip paint that doesn't completely go through to the steel. Now I do need the brush. I'm going to connect some of the chips to create larger areas. The edges are also easier to highlight with a brush. To do this, I brush off most of the paint until there's only a tiny bit left. Then, by holding the brush at the right angle, I can paint very fine highlights along all the longer edges. I'm adding more and larger chips to all the areas where there would be a lot of movement on the vehicle or where equipment would be stored. These areas would show the most wear and tear. And this is what our progress looks like after the light color chips are finished. All the details are definitely much more pronounced now. I don't usually do any chipping on the suspension and lower hull, as it always gets covered in dirt anyways. But I want to try it out. For this I'm mixing a light red from the base color and white. Then I also use a piece of sponge here for the chips. For step 2 of the chipping process, I mix a dark steel color from dark grey and saddle brown. These represent the scratches and chips that go through the paint to the steel. Now I need my smallest brush and a lot of dexterity. I'm now painting all the larger chips with the steel color. However, I'm leaving the light color visible at the very outer edge. This gives the chips more depth and makes them look three-dimensional. Since I first used this method, I think I've done all my models this way because the effect just looks that good. The techniques are the same as with the light color chips. In some places I also used the sponge again, although I have to be very careful with this as there are fewer steel chips. I will paint the brackets for the additional armor in a rust tone, just like I did these steel plates before. I paint the cruise periscopes and binoculars light grey, as these would not be camouflaged like the rest of the vehicle. Next up are the tools on the back. I'm using a dark grey as the base for the metal. I don't like using ready-made metallic colors like gunmetal or steel, as they often look far too shiny and glittery to my taste. Later on, I will make these parts look even more like real metal. There's a fire extinguisher hanging on the back. In the past, I always left it grey, but I found a reference picture where it was painted in an ochre tone. Since that adds a bit more variation, I decided on that color. For the wooden parts, I use old wood from Vallejo. Because exhaust systems often get very hot, it's common for the paint to flake off completely. The bare metal underneath then gets rusty very quickly. The base color for these rust effects is this light grey. Next, I mask off the surrounding parts with masking tape. Now I need to make the exhaust pipes look rusty. And for that, I need another small piece of sponge. I'm now dabbing the different rust colors onto the light grey painted areas. This gives me a good base to later use with further weathering effects to really bring out the rust effect. There are also a few decals that we still need to apply. Since my Jagdpanther isn't based on a historical 1-to-1 model, I can decide purely based on appearance which numbers and cross positions I want to use. Before applying the decals, I protected everything with a coat of satin clear varnish. In the past, I've often used glossy clear varnish, but it was difficult to get it matte again. Perhaps satin will work better. I use microsaw and microset for better decal adhesion. Up until now, I've ignored the tracks in this video. Since the color difference with such dark tones are quite difficult to film, I will give you a very brief summary. First, I primed the tracks in the dark brown track primer. Then I added some color variation using different rust and brown tones. Not sure how much of that will be visible later, but it's worth to try out. And all further effects will be achieved using enamel effects. And that concludes the painting part with acrylics. I think we've created a very promising foundation for all future effects. I really like the freehand camouflage and the subsequent highlighting, and the chipping also works well. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.